Okay, so this week the object we're going to look at, really objects, are bones from the people who ended up building a city called Amarna. And if you've watched the overview video of the New Kingdom, I talked about how Amenhotep IV um, ended up creating a city because he was worshiping the sun god. And so he moved the capital to this new city, which of course needed to be built. And I want to spend just a few minutes looking over some of the evidence of the people who were building this. And I want you to think about sustainability and especially think about social justice as we look through this. Now, this is a slide I had before on my other slides. Amenhotep IV, or he changed his name to Akhenaten, and his queen Nefertiti. They ended up trying to change up Egyptian religion by having everyone just worship one god, the sun god, Aten. And he ended up trying to, get rid of the names of the previous gods. Now, I'll tell you, it didn't last very long. As soon as he died, things started to fall apart. But for the time being, he ended up moving the capital so he would have a better chance of controlling everything and wanted to build this city called Amarna. I've taken this image from your map book on page 77, so make sure that you look at this. He ended up building fairly large building projects, or having his people build them, and in the end, it's not unclear how many people actually live there, but it's probably between 20 and 30,000. And sometimes this phase of Egyptian history within the New Kingdom is called the Amarna Revolution, where religion is changing, artwork is changing, lots of things are happening in a fairly short period of time. You can see the dates here, 1390 to 1295 BC. Now, we know quite a bit about the people who were working to build this city. There's lots of archaeology. There's a whole website called the Amarna Project, and I've given you that web link in our class. Now, when we look at what was happening with these people, the first thing we notice is that they're buried in pit graves. And if you remember, we looked at the evolution of sort of pyramid building, going way back to these pit graves, which are just simple holes dug in the ground. The body is put in, maybe a few grave goods, if that, and then covered. And the same thing is happening here. So if we look at these graves, you can see that there's no mummification. They were just put into the ground, and the dry sand sort of desiccated their bodies, which preserved them for us to look at. Sometimes you have markers, and I'll show you what one looked like, where it indicated that a body was buried, and not very many grave goods. So it's unclear whether it's because they were poor people and didn't have a lot of grave goods, or if the idea of burying things with people was starting to fall out of favor. More than likely, it's because they were very poor. And here's a slide. Let me grab my little pen here. This is showing you some of the markers. So here's a marker where you've got some stones, and then when the archaeologists dug down, they found a body under it. Okay, now I want to take a look at some of the specifics of these bodies, because they can tell us quite a bit about what was happening to the people who are building this city. So if we just focus on the children's skeletons, and I will tell you, in our course, I've given you the sources for all of this, so you can go through and read the articles that talk about the scientific data with all of this. If you just look at children's skeletons, there was malnutrition. So it looks like either they were fed the wrong type of food or not fed a variety of food, and this caused diseases like rickets and scurvy. If you look at their teeth, you can tell that there were signs of malnutrition because their teeth are not growing the way they should. They also looked at where muscles are attached to the bone, and if you have these really deep attachments on the bone, you can tell that the muscles were overworked, or they were worked much more than they should have been. So even in children, they were working way more than they should. We see delayed growth. So if you look at the height of these children and compare it to other time periods in Egypt, they weren't growing as quickly. And of course, it's probably no big surprise because they were malnourished. They have spinal trauma. That's usually an indication that they might have been carrying things way too heavy for their bodies. And then if you look at the death rates, if you look at people aged 15 to 20, you're kind of pushing into young adult at this point, not children, but they had higher death rates. So people were dying faster. Children were dying faster than other places. So again, think about social justice. These people were forcibly moved into this area and forced to work extremely hard to build this city for Akhenaten. When you look at the adults, you find the same thing. These people were shorter than others in Egypt, and it's because of being malnourished. If you look at the stress, so again, I mentioned you can look at where muscle attached to bone, and you can look for really deep attachments left on, or the outline on the bone. You can see that they were overworked. So I put down here at the bottom more pronounced muscle attachments. The adults showed skeletal stress. Many of them, way over half, had degenerative joint disease, and that's probably from lifting. And I'll show you what they were probably lifting here in the next slide. You also see that almost 70% of them had stress fractures. Now these are probably from lifting things. So what the stress fractures are is that they lift something that's too heavy, they fracture their bone. In some cases, when you look at the skeletons, you can see that the fractures had been healed, but then they fracture again. And so these people were in pretty terrible conditions. And as I put down here at the bottom of the slide, it's probably from carrying these blocks, which are a new technique found in ancient Egypt. These blocks were all standardized. So they're made out of sandstone. They are 20 and a half long by 10 and a half inches deep and 9 and a half inches high. And they weighed about 120 pounds. There was some variation, but it's thought that these were the size of blocks that one person could end up carrying on their own. And so lots of buildings in Amarna were built with these stones. And if you think about that size of stone, think back to all the stresses that these people had on their bodies, probably from carrying these and being overworked. Now, of course, what can these skeletons tell us? Well, I mentioned this at the very beginning and towards the end. It's really telling us about social justice during this period. These people were poor, they were malnourished, underfed, overworked. Even in a time when you've got lots of wealth coming into Egypt, the economy is clearly going very well because you've got all of these new buildings popping up all over Egypt. They've been pushing into Asia, they're pushing south into Nubia, bringing all that wealth in. So it isn't that this is related to, say, bad climatic conditions. This is because the rulers are overworking the people, and the skeletons are clearly showing that these people are suffering.